step back into October 1933, where the air in a rural Tennessee farmhouse kitchen hangs heavy with the scent of simmering beans. A woman sits at the wooden table, her 34 years of life betrayed by hands that appear 50, weathered by the relentless grit of the Great Depression. She is meticulously mending a pair of work pants for the third time this year, while outside, her husband stoically repairs a wagon while using a rusted piece of scrap metal and a hammer passed down from his father. This family has not touched a single greenback in 11 months, yet they are eating and their children are alive. It is a stark contrast to the families who were considered wealthy back in 1929. Across the county, those once prosperous names have vanished, relocated, or simply dissolved into the shadows of history. What we are witnessing is a clinical dissection of a dying social order, much like a forensic pathologist examining a body to find the exact moment the heart stopped. This investigation reveals the uncomfortable truth that survival was never about the balance in a bank account when a market peaked. Instead, those who endured were the ones who possessed assets that remained functional even when the medium of exchange became a useless fiction. When the fragile veneer of the paper system peels away, it exposes the raw, beating heart of the real economy underneath. This is not mere speculation or academic theory. It is a recurring historical reality. This pattern repeats with chilling precision in every currency crisis and systemic failure, proving that when money dies, only the tangible remains. The standard historical script is one we all know by heart. The 1929 stock market crash triggered a domino effect of bank failures, erased life savings, and sent unemployment rates into the stratosphere. In this version of events, the entire nation supposedly suffered in unison until the legislative intervention of the New Deal and the industrial surge of the World War finally dragged the economy back to its feet. But this is merely a sterilized corporate brochure of history, a non-threatening record that glosses over a much harsher reality. While not technically false, this perspective remains fundamentally incomplete because it masks a violent splitting of paths between two distinct classes of the impoverished. To grasp the mechanics of survival during a crash, one must first strip away the illusions of what money actually represents. At its core, currency is merely a legal claim on future goods and services, functioning through a fragile collective agreement rather than any inherent worth. It possesses zero intrinsic value. You cannot consume it for nutrients, ignite it to stay warm during a frost, or bury it in the soil to harvest a crop. Think of money as a shared social operating system, a digital interface that only coordinates human effort as long as every participant maintains absolute faith in the software. By 1929, the United States had constructed a dangerously sophisticated, highly monetized economy. Over 60% of the population resided in urban or suburban environments, far removed from the means of production. These families didn't grow their own sustenance. They operated in a loop where wages were earned in exchange for currency to buy life's necessities from strangers. While this setup is extraordinarily efficient during periods of growth, it harbors a fatal vulnerability. When the currency system fails or banks shutter, the entire transmission belt of society snaps. As deflation spirals and wages vanish, the gears seize completely. Without cash, the ability to purchase food, acquire essential tools, or even pay rent disappears. When the machinery of finance grinds to a halt, the economic landscape undergoes a violent structural shift. And in that moment, two distinct kinds of assets emerge. On one hand, you have paper assets, abstractions like stocks, bonds, bank deposits, mortgages, and contracts, whose worth is entirely predicated on the system's survival. On the other, there are real assets with immediate, intrinsic value: food, shelter, animals, tools, specialized skills, and land. During the Great Depression, the carnage was absolute for the former category. Between 1929 and 1933, the stock market hemorrhaged 89% of its value, while over 9,000 banks failed. Savings accounts simply vanished into thin air, and insurance policies were rendered worthless. This is the hidden mechanism of a crash. Value does not actually disappear. It merely relocates. It's like a tide receding from a digital shore to pool around the concrete. Value migrates from abstract future claims to present-day utility. While a paper portfolio evaporates, a chicken continues to provide eggs, a garden persists in growing tomatoes, and a pair of pliers still functions to repair a fence. The families who survived were not the ones holding the most claims on a broken system, but those possessing the most utility. Even a quarter-acre of land can be a lifeline, provided you stop viewing it as a speculative investment and start seeing it as a vital means of production. A well-managed quarter-acre plot is capable of generating between 500 and 1,000 pounds of vegetables annually, providing a family of 4 with a massive portion of their yearly requirements through crops like potatoes, beans, carrots, cabbage, tomatoes, and onions. To operate these systems, one only needed seeds, water, and an investment of effort. While the financial markets had run dry, labor remained an overflowing reservoir of a resource that absolutely nobody lacked. Contrast this resilience with the vulnerability of the urban professional who rented an apartment, possessed zero land, and remained entirely dependent on the mercy of grocery store shelves. For the modern professional, a severed paycheck acts like a guillotine for the dinner table. When the digital deposits stop, the food supply vanishes almost instantly. This reveals the brutal distinction between mere financial dependency and true self-sufficiency. Land in this era was never about the speculative pursuit of becoming wealthy. It was an engine of autonomy. While the consumer goods economy famously disintegrated during the Great Depression, the laws of physics remained cruel and constant. Things did not stop breaking just because the market stopped moving. If you could patch a leaking roof, your reward was the warmth of firewood. This synergy of specialized skills and physical tool ownership created a potent form of economic agency. While our modern consumption economy operates like a high-speed treadmill fueled by waste, where planned obsolescence is a deliberate feature and durability is viewed as a drag on quarterly profits, a systemic collapse completely inverts this logic. When the cash registers go silent, the repair or perish reality takes over. The ability to extend the lifespan of an object by years is no longer a hobby. It is a vital survival metric. Consider the implications of a 1934 survey conducted across rural townships in Iowa. Researchers discovered that households were engaging in an average of 11 barter transactions every single month. Surprisingly, the most frequently traded commodity was not raw manual labor, but specialized repair services. Those who owned the tools effectively became the community skeleton, providing the essential infrastructure that the state could no longer maintain. This leads us to a third pillar of resilience: food preservation equipment. We must examine something that appears entirely mundane, yet proved to be a life-or-death asset: the canning jar. Following a decade where the Ball Corporation and various manufacturers flooded the United States with millions of mason jars during the 1920s, these glass vessels became the literal vaults of the Great Depression. These specialized tools, ranging from pressure cookers and smokers to root cellars and those ubiquitous glass jars, functioned as a vital bridge across the seasons. While many today dismiss home preservation as a quaint hobby for artisanal jam enthusiasts, during the 1930s, it represented the razor-thin margin between a full stomach in February and literal starvation. The mechanics of this survival are clear once you analyze the seasonal volatility of agriculture. A standard garden plot in the heat of July produces a massive caloric explosion, yielding far more tomatoes, beans, and squash than any single family could possibly consume before they spoil. In a functioning market economy, this surplus acts as a liquid asset. You sell the excess to a buyer, convert the harvest into cash, and then use that currency to purchase food during the barren winter months. However, by 1932, the market had vanished. There were no buyers because there was no money. Without the means to preserve that summer abundance, the surplus simply rotted in the fields, leaving families vulnerable when the frost arrived. Families equipped with canning gear could bypass this systemic failure, processing hundreds of jars of vegetables, fruits, and pickles. They could smoke their meat and deposit their root vegetables into cool cellars. effectively banking their labor for the winter ahead. This strategy was not about luxury. It was the essential act of time-shifting calories, and the data proves it worked. Oral histories from Appalachian communities depict a stark reality where families relied exclusively on their glass stores for November through April. The menu was relentless: canned apples for breakfast and preserved goods for lunch. It was a monotonous, barely nutritional existence, yet it provided the life-sustaining fuel that others lacked. Families without this preservation infrastructure faced a binary fate. They gorged during the summer harvest and starved in the winter, where they desperately tried to buy food with a currency that had lost all utility. In a standard monetary economy, cash acts like a battery, storing the value of today's work for tomorrow's needs. When that electrical grid fails, you need a mechanical equivalent. Canning jars became that physical ledger, decoupling production from immediate consumption. Now we must turn our attention to the role of animals. This was a tactical retreat from capital-intensive livestock like cows or pigs, which demanded excessive space and feed. Instead, the resilient focused on chickens, goats, and rabbits, efficient creatures that could thrive on mere scraps while yielding consistent food. Maintaining a healthy laying hen yields a steady return of 250 to 300 eggs per year, which breaks down to roughly 5 eggs per week. For a household managing just 4 chickens, that translates to 20 eggs weekly. A surplus large enough to secure the family's nutrition while providing a liquid asset for the barter market. These birds function as biological refineries, scavenging on kitchen scraps, weeds, insects, and negligible amounts of grain. This is the ultimate form of nutrient arbitrage. By taking low-cost inputs like forage and waste, you are effectively minting high-value protein. The strategic potential of this was never clearer than in 1933, when grain prices collapsed so violently that corn hit 10 cents per bushel in certain Midwestern markets. Prices were so depressed that farmers chose to burn their crops for heat. Savvy survivors bought that nearly worthless corn to fuel their hens, converting a devalued commodity into tradable eggs. The same logic of biological conversion applied to dairy goats, where a single animal provided a quart of milk daily, or 7 quarts a week, for consumption, cheese-making, or trade. Even more impressive were rabbits. With their rapid reproduction and ability to thrive on grass and vegetable scraps, they offered perhaps the best feed-to-protein conversion ratio in the animal kingdom. Historical records from Depression-era extension offices in California and Pennsylvania reveal that backyard rabbit raising was actually promoted as a formal relief strategy for struggling families. These animals offered a masterclass in low-overhead production, requiring no land ownership, no expensive commercial feed, and offering rapid maturity rates that bypassed the long wait times of traditional livestock. However, there is a deeper layer of this strategy that most people overlook. These creatures functioned as biological refineries, processing household refuse into high-grade survival assets. In a booming market, waste is merely a liability you pay a city to haul away. In a systemic collapse, that same waste becomes a vital upstream input in a closed-loop production cycle. Vegetable peels were transmuted into chicken feed, lawn clippings became goat forage, and stale bread was recycled into rabbit meat. While the masses were paralyzed by a desperate, futile search for evaporating cash, those who owned these biological converters held massive economic leverage in the form of tradable food. This independence extended to basic infrastructure, specifically the need for wood stoves that operated outside the grid. By 1930, urban heating had become a trap of dependency, increasingly reliant on coal, gas, or oil delivered by utility monopolies and requiring constant cash payments. We must analyze how this lack of utility independence became a fatal flaw when the money stopped flowing. The vulnerability of modern living is never more apparent than when the grid fails. If you could not pay for your heat in the winter of 1932 to 33, the supply was terminated instantly. In Chicago, social workers observed a desperate form of asset liquidation. Families huddling in unheated apartments, burning their own furniture to stay alive while stuffing newspapers into broken window panes. The consequences were devastating, evidenced by a dramatic spike in cold-related pediatric illnesses across New York. This urban trap contrasted sharply with the survival of those using wood stoves. A wood stove is a piece of autonomous infrastructure, a system completely decoupled from utility companies and monthly financial obligations. By gathering or scavenging timber from marginal land, rural populations maintained total control over their environment. In rural Kentucky, families spent the fall stacking 2 to 3 cords of wood, which served as a 5-month energy reserve for both heating and cooking. This resilience was codified in a 1936 Resettlement Administration report, which noted that families in the Missouri Ozarks survived the Depression largely because they owned these stoves and had access to standing timber. These families did not need a bank account to maintain a hospitable climate. They simply needed an axe and the willingness to work. This underscores a vital pattern of autonomy. When the fiat architecture crumbles, independent systems endure. If a person's warmth depends on a continuous stream of cash, and that cash evaporates, the result is a lethal freeze. Paradoxically, the families who thrived with wood stoves were often financially poorer than their urban counterparts, yet they possessed the superior architecture of independence. By inheriting or intentionally designing lives that bypassed monetary transactions, their survival was guaranteed long after the currency failed. Beyond physical tools, however, lies a factor that is significantly harder to quantify, yet arguably the most critical for enduring a crisis. While the Great Depression saw the total seizure of formal markets, bank failures, and the death of enforceable contracts, the shadow economy of social obligation remained unbreakable. In tight-knit rural towns and ethnic enclaves, the currency of trust replaced the dollar. This informal infrastructure of mutual aid meant that if you helped a neighbor bring in their harvest, they would naturally step in to repair your roof. This parallel economy functioned through the seamless exchange of childcare, fresh milk, and manual labor, all moving without a single cent changing hands. Anthropologists recognize this as a reciprocal exchange system or a gift economy, where the ledger is written in social equity rather than bank deposits. You provided value today, not for an immediate fee, but because you lived within a network of mutual expectation. While these systems existed long before the crash, they became the primary survival mechanism when formal markets evaporated. We see this vividly in the oral histories of Italian enclaves in Philadelphia, Polish neighborhoods in Detroit, and the Mexican colonias of Los Angeles. These families survived by pooling resources and taking in relatives, creating a resilient human safety net. This is the brutal irony. Those who had climbed into the suburban middle class, severing extended family ties to embrace the isolated nuclear model, found themselves stranded on a social island. Without a paycheck, they had no fallback infrastructure and lost everything. The 1920s boom marketed upward mobility as the ultimate goal, but for many, it was a trap of economic isolation. By moving away from their roots, these families traded communal reliance for a professionalized, transactional existence that offered no backup. When the Great Depression hit, those who had made it were left stranded with no support network, while lower-income families who stayed in their original neighborhoods found their social bonds remained unbroken. Think about the gravity of that reversal. The very social structures deemed obsolete by the economic expansion became the only ones capable of surviving the contraction. This phenomenon is a recurring law of financial collapse. Look at Weimar Germany in 1923. When hyperinflation vaporized the currency, survival was a matter of owning tools, land, and tangible food stores for bartering. Decades later, during the 1990s Soviet collapse, the failing ruble was irrelevant to those with dachas, small country plots. By growing potatoes and preserving their own harvests, these families bypasses the state's failure entirely. Argentina stands as another stark historical precedent for why physical self-sufficiency remains the only absolute insurance policy. History proves that when paper wealth vanishes, value simply changes its zip code. We saw this in 2001 when Argentina's banking system froze and the peso evaporated. The economy didn't stop, It just relocated into neighborhood barter clubs where skills and goods were traded through informal credit. When a currency fails, value isn't destroyed. It flows into objects with immediate utility, favoring those who hold the physical keys to survival. Let's be clear, the Great Depression was no natural disaster, but a systemic failure that served as a massive wealth transfer. While the public suffered, giants like Chase National Bank and Bank of America didn't just survive, they consolidated power, buying up rivals for cents on the dollar. By 1935, the ownership of productive land and businesses had concentrated into fewer, wealthier hands. Even the Federal Reserve, founded in 1913 specifically to stop such a catastrophe, failed its mission entirely. Some even argue that by contracting the money supply, the Fed turned a recession into a total collapse. Ultimately, the heaviest price was paid by those who mistook the system's temporary stability for a permanent reality. The ultimate strategic error of the era was trading personal autonomy for systemic efficiency. Families voluntarily stepped into a monetary trap, exchanging the hard reality of tools and land for the soft illusion of paper assets and banking promises. They bet their lives on the permanence of currency, stability, and market recovery, only to be proven catastrophically wrong. When you look at the structural fragility of 1929, it becomes clear why the system could not end any other way. Household debt had hit record highs, margin debt in the stock market was at extreme levels, and wealth inequality had stretched to a breaking point comparable to our modern statistics. The financial sector had completely decoupled from the productive economy, while the gold standard acted as a monetary straitjacket, leaving the dollar too rigid to move. Once deflation set in, there was simply no mechanism to inject liquidity fast enough. The government was left with three grim options: let deflation starve millions, abandon gold to devalue the currency, or launch a massive state intervention. The United States eventually executed all three, but the process took agonizing years. Today, we must confront the fact that we live in the most monetized economy in human history. In this hyper-monetized landscape, the average individual has drifted dangerously far from the shore of self-sufficiency. Most people today possess no land, have lost the ability to produce their own food, and lack the basic skills required to repair their own tools. We have effectively offloaded our survival to a trust-based house of cards, a currency system that only remains upright as long as collective belief persists. When we look back at the Great Depression, the assets that saved families were not quaint relics of a nostalgic past. They were the essential gears of a functional infrastructure. Real value reveals itself only when economic abstractions fail, and it resides in land, tools, livestock, and community networks. These are not mere investments to be traded on a screen. They're the bedrock systems that keep life moving. The ultimate lesson of history is that the survivors of the last collapse were not those with the largest bank balances, but those who owned things that remained useful even when the money stopped working. While this historical analysis serves as educational research rather than financial advice, it is clear that the pattern of collapse is already rhyming with the past. We study these economic autopsies not for morbid curiosity, but to recognize the warning signs before the same systemic failures repeat. Most will remain blind to these cycles until the point of total fracture. But the real question is what remains useful in your hands once the system itself is gone.